Magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld Eldar.com. I'm Brent, and in this video I will be talking about the long-awaited, recently arrived update to our Forgeworld units. That is the Imperial Armor FAQ, which is now up on the Warhammer community site. I will link it in the video description, and this consists of a rules update for all of the datasheets that appear in that Forgeworld supplement. Now, for those of you who don't actually know what Forgeworld is and are totally confused by what I just said, in addition to the units in our codex, we also have access to a handful of datasheets that appear in Imperial Armor, a supplement put out by this subsidiary of Games Workshop called Forgeworld. And if you've heard people talk about things like Shadow Specters and Wraith Seers and wondered why they're not in the codex, well, that's because they're in the Forgeworld book. And the Forgeworld book has supplemental units for the majority of factions in the game. Historically, in various editions, the Forgeworld stuff has been a little bit stronger than the stuff in codexes. This has not been true in 8th and 9th edition. In fact, the good news is that post-FAQ, all of the units in Imperial Armor that Craftworlds can access are they're just better because they have access to rules that they didn't have access to before, like Strands of Fate. Nevertheless, they really don't stack up well against the stuff in the codex because none of the datasheets have actually been updated with any new stats or rules except to port rules over from the new codex, like Strands of Fate and the Wraithbone form rule, for example. And the point values have all stayed the same. And so the issue is, with reference to competitive play, pretty much everything in there that you might want to use in a competitive list has a similar unit in the Eldari Codex that's just objectively better in that role, definitely. One possible exception, and it really is just a maybe, is the Wraith Seer. Probably does still have some play. And this is, by the way, not to say, I'm going to talk about each of the ones that you're likely to use. I'll cover all the rules changes, and then I'll focus in on the 5 or so best Forgeworld units and talk about the obstacles to making the cut for a competitive list, but how you can still definitely use them in casual play. There's no reason not to use these units in many of your games. It's just that they're currently not optimal choices, and we'll go through why. It would be great to see a more comprehensive update, but I think we might be waiting until the next edition for that one, when they actually release a new Imperial Armor book. I hope not. I hope it's sooner, but I'm not holding my breath. Okay, here we go. Now, we could go through line by line each of the rules changes. So these start on page 4 of the FAQ, and it runs through changes to each of the units in the book. But I'm not going to do that because I can actually sum it up for you much more cleanly and much more neatly simply by generalizing. Everything got Strands of Fate. So before, if you were running a Hornet, it couldn't make use of your Strands of Fate dice, and now it can. Everything got access to versions of the powers that are referenced in the current codex rather than the previous codex. So, for example, if you look at the entry for Shadow Specters, it says they have battle focus, and then it says see Codex Craftworlds, which is actually the 8th edition codex. So I guess in theory, up until now, your Shadow Specters would have been using the old version of battle focus, but I don't think anybody was actually doing that. But rules as written, that was the case. So there's a change. And then models that have a more recent, so I mentioned before the Wraithbone form. So our Wraith units subtract 1 from incoming damage, right, in the Eldari Codex. And previously, that was not a thing, but some of the Wraith units in Imperial Armor had some special durability buff with a similar name. So, for example, the Wraith Seer ignored -1 AP. It no longer ignores -1 AP. Instead, that's been replaced with the typical Wraith durability bonus. Irolith, or Erilith. I'm still not sure how we're saying that, where the stressed syllable is. People who should know seem to say it different ways. Has received the standard Phoenix Lord buffs. So he now has access to Favored of Cain, which is the ability, among other things, that limits the amount of damage he can take in a single phase. So he has 6 wounds like all the Phoenix Lords, but he can now only take 3 in any individual phase. So he could take 3 damage in the shooting phase and then 3 in the melee phase, and that would take him out. But it's capped, which is nice. Extra durability there. And then I guess there are some other minor changes, which are actually just corrections. The Hornet now comes automatically with the Hornet pulse lasers. You still have to pay the 5 points for them, the same way that you have to pay for the Shuriken cannon on the Viper, but the model defaults to those. It was weird that it didn't say that before. It says that now. And I guess some of the Scorpion and the Cobra, it now expressly says that they can take war gear options, which I guess maybe was not totally obvious before. And that's really, Shadow Specters. They got the 5-up invuln that all of the Aspect Warriors have, and they're now a core unit. Obviously, they should be. All of the elite all of the Aspect Warriors have core, so of course they have it now too. So on the whole, this is great. The Phoenix Lord is more durable and can use Strands of Fate. Your Hornets can use Strands of Fate. Your Wraith Seer is a bit more durable and now can use Strands of Fate to make that D cannon a little bit more reliable, which is important, especially after the recent debuff to indirect fire units. So in that sense, all of this is a win. We should. I feel a little bit curmudgeonly for now saying that. Nevertheless, none of these units is a clear include for a competitive list. Again, except maybe the Wraith Seer, simply because even though they all got better, they don't. When you do the side by side with the most similar unit in the Codex, it doesn't. It's not a favorable comparison. Nevertheless, we're going to go through the 6 best, and then I will briefly generalize about the Wraith Knights. One at a time, and talk about what the challenges are and how best to use them under the circumstances, and why it's sort of touch and go. So we'll start with the Phoenix Lord, Erilith. This is on 172 of Imperial Armor. If you're following along, he's okay. The problem is that he didn't get the stat line update that all of the other Phoenix Lords got. So he looks pretty similar with his weapon skill and ballistic skill of 2. He has a movement of 12 because he's kitted out like a Shadow Specter. The strength and toughness of 4 are pretty standard. I think only Fugan is better because they've made Fire Dragons tougher. He's got the 6 wounds that they all have, but he's only got 4 attacks. And everybody else went to 6 attacks. And so this, we feel this. His attack output is only 50%. I'm sorry, all of the other Phoenix Lords have 50% more attacks, which statistically really adds up to something. And they all got this like buff to their weapons, their relic weapons, such that they're just a bit more powerful. The Phoenix Lord that is most similar to Erilith in terms of the role on the field is probably Bahareth. They are both fast-moving skirmishers with a CP-free deep strike ability who potentially can both shoot and fight and then avoid the enemy. The problem is that Bahareth is better at all of those. Just objectively, at every single one of those, he's much better, and they cost exactly the same amount of points. So Bahareth has a movement of 14 instead of a movement of 12, and after shooting or fighting in melee, he can just fly away, right? So as long as it says 9 inches from an enemy unit. And Erilith has a 12-inch move, can deep strike, and then is just sort of stuck there and can't do that. Bahareth's Fury of the Tempest shooting weapon is 24 inches, assault 4, strength 6, minus 2 AP, flat 2 damage, and unmodified hit rolls of 6 automatically wound. Arilith has assault 3, strength 8, minus floor, flat 3. So those are probably somewhat comparable. Arilith's shooting attack is a little bit better than Baharith's. He fires 1 fewer times, but the AP is better, and it's 3 damage instead of 2 damage. So he doesn't need the. Yes, Baharith automatically wounds on a 6. So I guess I said Baharith outshines him in all areas. That's not true. The shooting attack is a little bit better, but not significantly better. And then Baharith has better melee. He's got 6 attacks at strength 5, minus 3 AP, flat 2 damage, and all the 6s score an additional hit. And of course, you can manipulate that with Strands of Fate if you really needed to. And then he flies away before he can be hit back. Whereas Irilith is strength 5, minus 3, flat 2. It's just, he just doesn't, for 140 points. Oh, and also he's of course only got 4 attacks. So Baharith actually wildly outshines him on the melee front. There's just, I can imagine using Irilith in a list if you already had Baharith and you wanted a Phoenix Lord to like tootle around your backfield and the objectives that were just forward of your backfield, and but with Favored of Cain be sort of difficult to kill with access to the stratagem that maybe lets you resurrect him, because now, like all the Phoenix Lords, he can give himself objective secured, because in addition to getting Favored of Cain, he also, they added Shadow Specter to his data card. So he benefits, like any unit of Shadow Specters, from that ability. So he's fine. He's just definitely not as good as Baharith for the same points. And he no longer lets Shadow Specters reroll 1s to hit. He does the thing that all Phoenix Lords do, where he gives them +2 to their leadership and objective secured. So he's fine, but at 140 points compared to the other things that are available, he's just overcosted. Now, the Shadow Specters themselves have a similar issue. They just don't stack up well against Warp Spiders. So they're 26 points per model, instead of the 20 points per model of the Warp Spiders. They have the same stat line, and I've complained about this elsewhere in my Forgeworld video, the Shadow Specter Exarch has no access to Exarch powers and has exactly the same loadout as a regular Shadow Specter. So he's just a regular Shadow Specter with an additional wound and an additional attack. Oh, that's another thing, because they didn't actually update the data sheets. Shadow Specters are now the only Aspect Warriors that only have 1 attack. All the other Aspect Warriors went to 2 attacks. Shadow Specters, except for the melee ones, which got more. Shadow Specters are still stuck at 1. Now, their thing is that they get a CP-free Deep Strike, and then when you target them, they're -1 to hit. Warp Spiders have Flicker Jump, which makes them more difficult to charge, and then they have the Warp Spider Jump Generator, which lets you battle focus 2d6. So in terms of the special abilities, they can both show up with a CP-free Deep Strike, and then Shadow Specters are -1 to hit, but Warp Spiders have these 2 things, which I think definitely outweigh what Shadow Specters have. And then if you look at the shooting profile, a unit of 5 Warp Spiders, because the Exarch can take an extra Death Spinner, are putting out 6d6, strength 6, -2 AP, flat 1 damage, blast shots. Shadow Specters have a dispersed profile and a focused profile. In theory, the dispersed profile is good for cleaning up light infantry, and the focused profile is good for taking out heavy infantry or damaging monsters and vehicles. The problem is that even their focused profile is only strength 6, so which is what the Warp Spiders have. So we'll just take a quick look at the math. If you are targeting a horde unit, so let's say you're targeting 20 gaunts where blast is going to work, the Warp Spiders, again, because the Exarch has 2 Death Spinners, are putting out 36 shots at strength 6 with -2 AP, and the Shadow Specters are putting out only 30 shots at strength 5 with -1 AP. So the Warp Spiders are objectively better against hordes. And then if you come up against something that's tough, say T6 with, I don't know, a 3-up save and more than 3 wounds, some light vehicle or monster, if you run the yes, the focused lance from, that's not a lance, the focused attack from the prism rifle from the Shadow Specters has -3 AP and does flat 3 damage. The Warp Spiders only do 1 damage, but they're putting out 6d6 shots at the same strength as the Shadow Specters with only 1 less AP. And if you run the math, on average, the Warp Spiders are actually doing slightly more damage than the Shadow Specters. So the Warp Spiders are better against literally every target. They're much better against hordes. They have better extra abilities, and they're only 20 points per model instead of 26 points per model. And the Exarch gets other bonuses, can access Exarch powers. The Shadow Specters have no Exarch powers. They all have additional attacks. The Shadow Specters have no additional attacks. So there's really no reason at all that you would ever take Shadow Specters instead of Warp Spiders. They just don't make the cut, and they're more expensive to boot. And this is a theme, really, with the Forge World stuff right now. All of it is at least 10% more expensive than it should be relative to the stuff in the Codex, because the point values for the Craftworld stuff either stayed the same or went up a bit, but the data sheets got much better for the most part. Some things actually got cheaper, like Vipers. Whereas the stuff in Forge World did not. They didn't get new data sheets, so none of it's gotten better, and it's still sort of freighted with the same point costs as before. And this is a nice segue into the Hornet, which is just way, way expensive for what it does relative to stuff in the Codex. The Hornet used to be the best back in 8th edition, was the best Forge World model available to Craftworlds, hands down. The Hornet is this like zippy little 1-elf attack tank that is like less than a Falcon, but more than a Viper in terms of the size of the chassis and the loadout. Now, when the 9th edition Imperial Armor came out, the new Imperial Armor, the Hornet took a big nerf. Its standard weapon, the Hornet Pulse Laser, was significantly downgraded. Well, it was not significantly downgraded. It was slightly downgraded, but the whole tank also became more expensive. So including the cost of the 2 Pulse Lasers, the Hornet is 90 points, and it has 2 of these Pulse Lasers that are heavy 2, strength 7, -2 AP, flat 2 damage, which is okay, but it's objectively worse now than the Star Cannon, which is exactly that same profile, except it's -3 AP instead of -2 AP. So for one thing, you can swap out the Hornet Pulse Lasers for Hornet Star Cannons for literally the same points. There's no reason you would ever not do that, because all you're doing is giving an additional AP. So thing number one, most of us built our Hornets with Pulse Lasers. Some people out there used Bright Lances. Interesting. Clever you. But there's now no reason anybody would ever take a Hornet Pulse Laser, because it is the same points as a Star Cannon, and it just has worse AP. So there's that. But it's also arguably just a bit too expensive at 90 points. It's fast. It has a movement of 18, which is even faster than the 16 on the Viper. It's T6 instead of T5, so it's tough for what it is, and it has 8 wounds instead of the 6 wounds on the Viper. Now, the Viper, by the way, is the thing that which is the most obvious comparison for the Hornet. I should have said that earlier. And the Hornet comes standard with -1 to the attacker's hit roll. So the real edge, the Hornet has an extra heavy weapon. It doesn't have the 4 shuriken catapults that the Viper has, but it has an extra heavy weapon slot, and it is -1 to hit with 2 more wounds and better toughness. So it is tougher. The thing is, at 90 points for the most basic Hornet, you can get 2 Vipers, which now, with the upgrades to the Shuriken Cannon, your 2 Vipers are putting out 6 shots at strength 6, -1 AP, flat 2 damage, which is not as good as the strength 7 as the star cannon profile, right? But you also then have 8 shuriken shots, and you have 12 wounds, and they can be on different places on the table, and they can help you. Because there's fewer points tied up in a Viper, they can help you score things like engage on all fronts, and to grab midfield objectives, and to create inefficiencies in your opponent's list, because the amount of firepower necessary to target them and eliminate them, especially when you can auto-roll some 6s with Strands of Fate to save, ends up being disproportional. Whereas with the Hornet, I think the Hornet is still usable, and it's nice that it has Strands of Fate now. It's just at 90 points, it's probably 10 to 15% just too expensive to really compete with the other options available. So it's still one of the best options. It's better than, I think, the Shadow Specters, definitely than the Shadow Specters or the Phoenix Lord relative to the stuff in the Codex. But I still think that it's a bit of an uphill battle to convince yourself to take a Hornet instead of 2 Vipers. Now, if you built your Hornet with Bright Lances, it's flat 100 points. And with the upgrades to the Bright Lance and the Strands of Fate bonus, I do think there's a case here. Obviously, you can get the same loadout for fewer points on a Warwalker. If you put 2 Bright Lances on 2 Vipers to match the fire output, that does end up being a little bit more expensive, but then you have flexibility on the table, and if you're running something like Beltan or Ulthway, the rerolls are more likely to get you there with the single Bright Lance on the Viper, I suppose. The two Bright Lances for the Hornet is probably now the best build for the Hornet. I still think it's a little bit overcosted. The mobility is great, being able to get a bead on your opponent, but I do think it's a little bit overcosted, but I also think it's quite playable. It's just too bad it's not 10 points cheaper. Okay, the Lynx. The Lynx is not bad. The Lynx used to be a pretty good deal back when it could benefit from autarchs to let it reroll 1s to hit, or the Farseer stratagem that let you reroll 1s to wound when it could make use of Doom and Guide. The Lynx, back in the day, the Lynx was one of our stronger options back in 8th edition, and it's now at 220 points for the quality of its heavy weapon. It's just a bit overcosted. The Lynx Pulsar is 48 inches, heavy 6, strength 9, minus 3 AP, so that's great. But flat 3 damage, I want it to be D3 plus 3. I feel like that's probably where it should be relative to the other stuff in the Codex. Then it would be a really powerful backfield heavy support option. It does have a 5-up invuln save. It's T7 with 16 wounds, so it's really durable, but it has a declining profile, and at 220 points for the basic chassis, it's a lot. It's just, yes, now that we have Strands of Fate, you can guarantee some of those 5-up invuln saves. You can spend another 10 points and give it a Bright Lance, or another 5 points and give it a Star Cannon. Those are relatively cheap heavy weapons at that cost, up its fire output a little bit. But the real question is, let's say you put a Star Cannon on it. It's 225 points. You know what else you can get for 225 points? 3 Warwalkers in a squad, each with double Bright Lances that you can fire and fade out of line of sight. And those cost the same points, also have 5-up invuln saves, and do D3 plus 3 instead of flat 3. Now, yes, strength 9 is nice on the Pulsar, but I just don't think it hits quite hard enough for the points. Again, is it usable? Sure, totally. And if you put vectored engines on it for another 10 points and maybe buy a Star Cannon or a Bright Lance, for 1 turn you can fire and fade it out of line of sight by burning out without spending CP, by burning out the vectored engine. 2 CP is a lot to fire and fade a vehicle, right? So maybe that's a case against doing it with the Warwalker, certainly against doing it every turn. And then if you have other stuff that you're going to expose to enemy fire, and that is in a list that presents your opponent with a plurality of targets, like maybe you have multiple Wraith Lords or something, and they have to make hard decisions, the Lynx is probably tough enough and durable enough with all of those wounds to hang in there for a while and do some work. It's definitely not crap. It's just, again, it's this theme that we're seeing. For its fire output, it's probably just, it's a little bit too expensive, right? If it were even 20 points less, right? If it came down 10%, right? At 220 points, that would be 22 points, a little more, say 25 points, it would have a better claim on us. But it's edged out, I think, by other codex options. It's also a large chassis. It can be hard to hide something that big. One quirky additional advantage to the Lynx is that when you advance, it auto advances 12. Now, because it has a heavy weapon, the movement characteristic on the Lynx is 18 when it has all its wounds. So it's when you advance with it, it is a 30-inch move. That's really fast. But unless you're trying to score something like Engage on All Fronts in the late game, it's a little bit hard to see how and why you would use this, especially when, unless you're running the custom Craftworld trait that lets you do it, you're not going to be, if you do advance with it, you're not going to be able to fire its heavy weapon anyway. So the Lynx is fine. You could play it. I love it. It's a beautiful model, right? I have a second one in my collection that I've never actually put both of them on the table. I really can't imagine doing it now, but I love looking at them, and certainly in casual games. Here's the other thing with this, the Forge World stuff. When you do need to take it down a notch for casual play, by all means, like, run all your Forge World stuff. It's not bad. It's just not optimal. Okay, the Warp Hunter. Some people love the Warp Hunter just emotionally. They have this attachment to it because conceptually it's so cool. The Warp Hunter is this like trim hunter-killer vessel that has this D weapon that tears holes in the fabric of reality and sends enemy tanks, monsters, and infantry wailing into the space between spaces. And that's super cool. I don't know if it's a bias, but I was not on board with the Warp Hunter with the rules even before we got the new codex. I thought it was just way too overcosted. I know some people were running them with some success, but it's 195 points if you don't add anything to it. It has a single weapon. Well, it's got twin shuriken catapults, but it has a single weapon of consequence, which is the D flail. Does not have great range. So one profile is 24 inches, heavy D3, strength 12, -4, D3 plus 3, blast, so that's cool. But on average, you're putting out 2 shots. It hits hard, but you're putting out 2 shots. And then the rift is heavy 3, strength 12, -4 AP, but then D6 damage, and it auto hits. So that's like the flamer attack. And again, that's good, but it's 200 points. And in a game when there are lots of invuln saves, and there are ways to auto succeed on invuln saves, and there are feel no pains, 2 very hard hitting shots is just, which is going to be the average on the first one, and the second one you're only getting 1 more shot, and it's D6 instead of D3 plus 3. So on average we're looking at 2 very hard hitting shots. You have to be very close to your opponent to do it, and this tank does not want to be engaged in melee, so you have to be to use this kind of hovering around the midfield within melee threat range of your opponent. Obviously you can screen it, right? So it's a little bit of an unfair criticism, but the damage output just isn't sufficient to justify it. When you look at the cost, I mean, when this was written, Bright Lances did not do D3 plus 3. Now they do. So a Bright Lance, it doesn't have the same strength, obviously, but it does have the same AP. A Warwalker with 2 Bright Lances hits almost as hard as this thing with a 36-inch range and costs 85 points. That's a lot less than 200. Now, yes, the deflail can target weapons not, or target models not visible to the bearer when it uses the blast profile. But if there were any question about this, the big nerf to blast, so now if you target something out of line of sight, it reduces your ballistic skill by 1. So even on its top profile, it would only be hitting on a 4-up, and your opponent gets +1 to the saving throw, so that AP -4 becomes AP -3, and if they're on the opposite side of something like a ruin, it's actually only AP -2. It's just too expensive. Too expensive. Warp Hunters really don't have a place outside of casual play. Again, conceptually, they're so cool. I like the models. Full disclosure, this is the only, of the models that I'm talking about today, this is the only one that I don't own. It's actually the only thing in the whole Craftworld's line that isn't one of the insane Titans. I don't have a Cobra, like the super tanks, that I don't have multiples of. I've never been able to get on board with its cost, even though I do like the model. But it seems important and fair to mention that I think this is the only model that I've ever talked about or written about that I have never actually run myself. So maybe my input on this one is somehow less valuable. Okay, the Wraith Seer. The Wraith Seer is essentially a heroic version of the Wraith Lord, which for 30 points more comes with some obligatory upgrades. I suppose this is a little bit of a mischaracterization, only insofar as Wraith Lords are elites and have the core keyword, and Wraith Seers are heavies and do not. Now, this of course means that Wraith Lords can benefit from Doom and Guide and from Autarchs if you're running an Autarch. And Wraith Seers don't have those advantages, but they do have other advantages that arguably offset that, and in some lists, the Wraith Seer is probably going to be the better pick. Think of it like this. What if I were to say to you, your Wraith Lord for 10 more points can have a 5+ invulnerable save? You would probably pay those 10 points, and the Wraith Seer has that. The Wraith Shield provides a 5-up invuln save, which, with Strands of Fate, now that we can auto-succeed on some armor saves, is even better. And there are plenty of -4 AP weapons in the game that will just go right through a Wraith Lord's armor and go straight to damage, and having the opportunity to fall back on an invuln is big. When we're concerned about durability, especially, I will say if you're running Ulthway, maybe this is a little bit less appealing because your Wraith Lord already has the 6-up Feel No Pain. But on the other hand, Ulthway casters get a bonus, and this is my next question. Imagine if I were to say to you, okay, for 10 more points, your Wraith Lord will also be able to cast Runes of Battle Power or Smite. You would pay those 10 points. I feel confident in the vast majority of your lists. And so that's a big win right there. This last of the 3 upgrades, if you think of it as paying 10 points per, you might balk at a little bit, and that's the Ghost Spear for 10 points, which comes in at Strength 10, -3 AP, does D3 +3 damage, and back in 8th edition seemed pretty awesome because nothing did D3 +3, pretty much, and the Ghost Glaive was not nearly as good. Now, it's not quite as favorable a comparison. Yes, the Ghost Glaive is 15 points, but it's coming in at with two different profiles. One is Strength 9, -4 AP, D3 +3. In the vast majority of cases, the fact that the Ghost Spear is Strength 10 really won't matter. You're going to be wounding most of the same stuff on a 3-up or a 2-up if it's small, but the Ghost Glaive actually has -4 AP. So I think if you're choosing between Strength 10 and Strength 9, but the Strength 9 weapon has the -4 AP, that's the better pick. So even the Crushing Strike on the Ghost Glaive is better, and then it also has a Sweeping Blow, which is Strength 7, -2 AP, flat 2 damage, but you make 2 attack rolls instead of 1, so you get 8 attacks. So the Wraith Lord with the Ghost Glaive is robust against melee hordes, against big infantry units, even if they have some kind of invuln save. And that's just not true of the Wraith Seers. So the Ghost Glaive, for the 15 points, it's better. You would never pay 10 for a Ghost Spear when you could get a Ghost Glaive for 15. You also have the option with the Wraith Lord to take nothing at all and just have Wraithbone Fists, which are still pretty damn good at strength 7, minus 3 AP, flat 3 damage. Even without the Ghostglaive, it's pretty darn good in melee. So in that sense, the Wraithseer is bringing up the rear a little bit. If it makes you feel better, you can imagine yourself as paying 5 points for the Ghost Spear and 15 points to be a caster. But I think that it's a reasonably pointed upgrade for the additional 30 points. The other trade-off for the Wraithseer is that you only have one heavy weapon slot, but to compensate for that, you're able to take a D-cannon. However, recently the D-cannon has been nerfed because indirect fire weapons have been nerfed. The profile remains the same as it ever was, but now indirect fire conveys -1 to the ballistic skill for the round, well, for the attacks that are making use of the indirect attack, and gives the opponent +1 to an armor save. So the D-cannon, which costs 40 points, which used to be the default loadout for the Wraithseer, is not quite what it once was, to be fair. It's still good. It hits monstrously hard, and -4 AP means that even an opponent who's getting +1 to an armor save, and then if it's an infantry unit that's able to make use of cover that's on the other side of a ruin, it's getting another +1, and if it has Armor of Contempt, I guess maybe Space Marines could still save on a 4-up against it. But it's still really good, and keep in mind that there's no reason that you can't target opponents that you can see, in which case those penalties are not there. Nevertheless, I can certainly imagine many circumstances in which a Wraith Lord would make more sense. For one thing, if you're running a Shuriken list, a Wraith Lord with a Ghostglaive on in its paw and 2 Shuriken cannons is coming in only at 135 points, and it's really dangerous. And that's way cheaper than the Wraithseer with, say, the D cannon at 170. Yes, it's not a caster. Yes, it does not have the invulnerable save, but that is a big savings, and certainly in a Shuriken list, that's going to be the thing that you want. Similarly, I think there are reasons to consider running a Wraithseer a Wraith Lord with a couple of Star Cannons or a couple of Bright Lances. Even with 2 Bright Lances and a Ghostglaive at 155, that Wraith Lord is still cheaper than the Wraithseer. Yeah, it doesn't have the 5-up invuln. And it can't cast psychic powers, but depending on what you need it to do in your list, that might be the move. Now, speaking of what you need it to do in a list, I think this is really, this might be where the Wraithseer and the Wraith Lord differ slightly. I think they play a similar role. So the way that the Wraithseer has functioned historically before the FAQ and still functions after the FAQ is really this. Your Wraithseer, or Wraithseers, move to the midfield just in front of your deployment zone, stay out of line of sight. They use their D-cannons to put indirect fire on enemy units that have moved into the midfield, and they use their psychic casts to buff key friendly units, or potentially debuff enemy units that have moved into the midfield. In the late game, turns 4 and 5, when there's not a lot left on the table that's dangerous to the Wraithseer, it pops out and jumps onto objectives maybe and messes stuff up with its Ghost Spear and starts casting Smite instead of whatever the other thing was. That's how you use a Wraithseer. It was before, and it still is. It doesn't make sense to sit, even though it's toughness 8 and it's got a pretty good armor save, it's just too expensive to sit it out in the open on an objective. Now, Wraith Lords are a little bit different. One other thing with the Wraithseer, you can do this with the Wraith Lord too. It's a melee counterpuncher. So if your opponent bears down on you with some powerful, big-ass assault monster like a Demon Prince or a couple of Carnifexes or something, the Wraithseer can pop out and carve up a hard target with its Ghostglaive. That tool is there too. Now, Wraith Lords with Ghostglaives can also do that, and they're also good against infantry, and you can give them some decent heavy weapons loadouts, but because you can keep a Wraith Lord much cheaper than that typical 170 on the Wraithseer, it's kind of okay to have some Wraith Lords that are exposed to some enemy fire and are providing target diversity and maybe drawing some of your opponent's hard-hitting stuff away from other things, and you can succeed with 6s. There are certainly Wraith Lords that have appeared in top-performing tournament lists It's a relatively affordable tool that you can fall back on. That melee presence on the board, like protecting your backfield, 2 out of 3 games it's not going to matter, but when it matters, it's big. It's very efficient for its points. So whether or not a Wraithseer makes sense in a list, I think really comes down to some degree to what you need it to do. Those are two subtly different roles. And then also what other stuff you're running, what kind of list it is. I think that it's entirely plausible that in the majority of builds, the Wraith Lord still will have a little bit of an edge, but I do think the Wraithseer definitely has a place in competitive play. There are certain lists in which it's going to be the better pick. Now, in theory, lastly, a Wraithseer doesn't have to take the D-Cannon. It could take a single heavy weapon of some other variety. So in theory, you could run a 140-point Wraithseer that had a scatter laser or a shuriken cannon or something. And maybe there is some argument for doing that in some build. I remember back when we didn't have something like the Ghost Spear, I remember idly wondering if maybe I should not have magnetized my Wraithseer just to run it naked with the Ghost Spear. And I think that's no longer tempting. If anybody out there actually has magnetized Wraithseers, this is like one of the least magnetizable units, I think, in the whole codex. But if you do have a magnetizable Wraithseer and you've tried this, I'd be interested in hearing about it in the comments below. I feel like in that role, the Wraith Lord really is better, but maybe if you needed to get another caster in, there would be an argument for it. Oh, and if you don't own a Wraithseer, keep in mind that you can always run like a 130-point Wraith Lord and just take a Warlock Conclave, and you basically end up with something similar. It doesn't have the invulnerable save, of course. In an Oathway list, that doesn't matter. But this has gotten a little bit long-winded. But if you have a collection of Forge World models, I think that of those models, the Wraithseer is the most likely to find a place in your current list. It remains very good. Okay, I'm not going to talk about the Nightwing, the Scorpion, and the Cobra, except to say that they're a bit overcosted. The Nightwing in particular, because you can't hide flyers, you can't keep them out of line of sight. That's if you don't get first turn, that's potentially 220 points sunk. It has the same sorts of issues that the Hemlock and the Crimson Hunter have. And the Cobra and the Scorpion are just too damned expensive at 450 and 500 points, respectively. It's just too much for the utility that they bring to the army. Also, some people still have not realized that the Auxilia heavy support slot. So if you have to take 3 super heavy units in order for them to benefit from sub-faction bonuses. I've said this in videos before, and I get angry comments from people who are like, it doesn't say that on the data sheet. But if you look at the core rulebook and you go to the detachment section and look at the detachment rules for the super heavy Auxilia detachment, where you take a single super heavy unit, you will notice that they don't benefit from sub-faction bonuses. And that is a kick in the teeth, especially for Eandon players. That means that if you take a Wraith Knight, your Wraith Knight actually doesn't get the Eandon bonus unless you take 3 of them. I fundamentally do not understand this either from like rules balancing perspective or from the perspective of fluff and lore. It just really doesn't make sense. I suspect that somebody at GW worked out that with one of the other factions, I don't know what, maybe taking Imperial Knights as allies or something, I really don't know. There was some like crazy thing that you could do that they were trying to head off. I don't know what that thing is, but at least from the perspective of a Craftworlds player, the super heavy units are already wildly overcosted. They don't need they just don't need that extra nerf in addition to the CP that it costs to add a super heavy unit. The Scathach Wraith Knight has the same issues. It's frankly just too expensive for the amount of firepower that it brings. It's 325 points base, but then you have to add additional weapons to it. The Infernal Lance is 65 points, heavy D6, and it still only does D6 damage, which just in the current in the current meta, compared to the other stuff in the Codex, it's kind of laughable that a weapon that expensive doesn't do D3 plus 3. Yes, if you're within half range, so if you're within 12, it does D6 plus 2. Whoop-de-doo. Not that exciting. The Death Shroud Cannon, which is probably the better option, is 55 points per Death Shroud Cannon. So even though the base model is 325, you're either giving it 2 Death Shroud Cannons, kicking it up 110, or 2 Infernal Lances, kicking it up 130. The notion that at 455 points, it has it has the same chassis as a regular Wraith Lord, and yes, now it reduces incoming damage by 1. And its special claim to fame is that it can you can bring it in from deep strike. So the advantage to the Scathach Wraith Knight is that your opponent cannot take it out if you don't get first turn, and you don't have to mess around with I don't know, trying to put it into reserve or something. But it's just too expensive. I do own one of these. It's a neat model. I think it's fun to if you're going to run one Wraith Knight, it does actually make sense to run this one because you can start it off the field and make sure it doesn't get blown away first turn. Whereas if you're going to run Wraith Knights, you might as well run 3, right? Regular Wraith Knights, because it doesn't really make sense to put a Scathach Wraith Knight into Deep Strike if you also have 2 regular Wraith Knights, because then you have target saturation anyway. Never do that. You might as well have its firepower on first turn, because your opponent's not going to be able to take out 3 Wraith Knights. I don't care what's in that list on first turn. So I guess if you want to run a singleton Wraith Knight in a casual game, the Scathach Wraith Knight is not a bad pick. On the other hand, once the assumption is already that it's a casual game, we're much less worried about optimization anyway. I love my Wraith Knights. They're so fun. But Craftworld's Wraith Knights, despite their significant boost in the 9th edition Codex, might still be the single worst Titanic unit in the game, which is sad. Okay, so that's what I've got. The Forgeworld stuff, it's gotten better. It's lots of fun. The Wraithseer really does have potential. I think there's still a place in competitive lists for Wraithseers because of Strands of Fate. The rest of it, and maybe the Hornet. In very specific circumstances, maybe the Hornet, maybe. You could use a Rilith if you're already using Baharath, but pretty much everything else is in the realm of casual only. And even those 3 units that theoretically you could use, really, I think only the Wraithseer makes sense to think about seriously. And even then, the Wraith Lord is seriously giving it a run for its money. If you found this video useful, I hope that you will consider liking it and leaving a comment. If you have your own thoughts about the effects of the recent FAQ on the Craftworld's Forgeworld options, I hope you will leave them in the comments below. Or if you just want to help out my algorithm by saying hello in the comments below, that would be nice too. I will be back soon with new content. My Patreons enjoy early access to the vast majority of my videos, so if you are interested in obtaining early access to these videos, you might consider becoming a Patreon. I will try to link that also in the video description. Thanks so much, everybody. Back again soon. Best of luck in your next campaign, and good luck with those Wraithseers. They're beautiful models. I love mine too. Take care.